assistance for non-public schools. This is also known as EANS program, and in particular, EANS 1. You will find today's slide deck attached to your meeting invite. That should have been received, but I do have to put a full disclaimer, you don't have this slide in your slide deck. So as I was walking through everything and kind of talking it through out loud, there have been various federal packages that have been passed, and all of them intersect with non-public school services a little bit differently. So it's important for you to recognize that the federal funding that was provided in March of 2020, that falls under the CARES Act. That had equitable services through your local public district. Many of you are familiar with that type of service, such as your Title I program. Under the second COVID relief package, I call it CRRSA, C-R-R-S-A, that is when EANS was introduced. So EANS 1 in particular, that happened this past December. Now the most recent federal package happened March 11th of 2021. It's called the American Rescue Plan Act, and EANS 2 is a part of that. I want you to note that for today, we are focusing only on EANS 1. As of today, other than the federal statute with a couple lines, I have no information on the rollout program expectation of EANS 2, other than what I'm able to interpret in that federal law. So I just want you to kind of keep that in mind as a frame of reference. There will be additional programming, webinars, supports with EANS 2 as we learn more and when we learn more. Okay, so as I mentioned, the slide deck for today's meeting is in your handouts or in your meeting invitation, as well as the application itself. What we'll all be talking about and going through today include the purpose of the EANS program and the general overview, and the general overview of the EANS program. Additionally, we'll talk about the eligibility and planning allocations that were released last week, the application requirements and submission requirements, also the types of assistance and services that are available, some special considerations, those timelines, and then resources that we have either ready to go right now or that will be forthcoming. So first, we'll dive into the purpose and overview. As I mentioned, EANS 1 is a part of the CRRSA Act, that second pool of funding. Something that you might see associated with that is that it was a part of the Governor's Emergency Education Relief Fund, or the GEAR Fund. This EANS program, the governor's office had to apply, and after they applied, then the funds were directly deposited into the state department's budget to be implemented. Now, EANS 2 is structured differently, but this is EANS 1. So you'll hear some state departments talk about the GEAR fund and how it intersects with the EANS program. North Dakota's allocation for the EANS program is $3.9 million. Now with that, there is a allowability for the State Department to reserve $200,000 for administration. And we do anticipate that that will be reserved to fund things such as our contracting, web process, reimbursements, potential monitoring structures, and then procurement implementation and processes. You'll see the service window, March 13th, 2020 through September 30th, 2020. Although this is, I'm sorry, 2023. Thank you, Jane. Although this is the window that services and reimbursements may be able to be requested from non-public schools, there is a tighter timeline as far as the implementation and budgeting, and we'll go through that today. But this is just a general overview of what you will have. You'll have access to those reimbursements. So under the EANS program, school districts, public school districts are not required to provide equitable services to non-public schools through the ESSER or GEAR program. So on that first tile where I showed the CARES Act, those public districts needed to provide equitable services to the non-public schools. Under the second and third stimulus, that requirement is not in place. But what it does do, in particular, EANS 1 allows for the state education agency to provide a reimbursement or services to eligible non-public schools that were impacted by COVID. Please note, from everything that we see so far, EANS 2 will not allow for reimbursement. It will only allow for services. That's our current understanding. Now, our state is challenged with prioritizing the services and assistance to those non-public schools that enroll higher numbers of low-income students and those that are most impacted by COVID-19. North Dakota took an approach that would do this primarily through our funding formula. So with that, we will move right along to the estimated allocations. So hopefully everyone received, not hopefully, everyone should have received the estimated allocations. They were emailed through our constant contact. If you are attending right now on behalf of a non-public school and are not receiving our correspondence or emails, please reach out through the chat, through email to Jane Gratz. Her email is indicated on the last slide of the slide deck. We'll make sure that you get added to the non-public school distribution list, so you're receiving all of those emails. When it comes to eligibility, it is indicated in the law that the non-public schools must serve K-12 students, and that I am going to see if I can mute. Just if everybody could make sure their mics are on mute, that would be helpful.
So you did say that you use like the...
Hang on one second. Jane,
And I muted them all. I muted all, so you'll have to unmute yourself.
okay.
Okay.
I think I'm back. All right.
Okay. Me too.
Thank you. Thanks, Rebecca. Yeah, if we can make sure mics are muted, then that's helpful with some background noise. So the non-public school, the EANS program has eligibility requirements built in. So first, the public or the district, non-public district must serve K-12 students. Unfortunately, non-public preschool programs are not eligible to apply, and their numbers do not go into consideration for the enrollment numbers. The non-public school had to be in existence prior to March 13th, 2020. They must be an approved non-public school through DPI and recognized for that 1920 school year. They must be an established nonprofit, meaning for-profit schools are ineligible. And there's some requirements regarding PPP, or the Payroll Protection Program. And I'm going to go through that in more detail on the next slide. Also, in order for a non-public school to be eligible, an application must be submitted. So if you would like to have your non-public school receive services or reimbursement through EANS, an application must be submitted with allowable activities or reimbursement or future services proposed in order to be considered. The application is considered your letter of intent.
So it's not safety. No, let's see if it is.
So there is eligibility requirements regarding the PPP, or Payroll Protection Program. If a district or a non-public school received PPP before December 27th, 2020, keeping in mind that is when the second stimulus package was identified. I'm going to mute another mic here for some background noise. Okay, so PPP, if you received it before December 27th, 2020, you can still apply for the EANS program. But as a part of the EANS application, you must disclose the amount of that PPP loan, and you have to assure that you're not going to use it to double dip. If you got a PPP last summer, let's say summer, July, August 2020, and you used it for some payroll reduction or computer equipment, you would not then use this EANS program to double dip towards payroll, which is not allowable, or equipment. Now, if you apply for a PPP after December 27th, 2020, so the most recent round of PPPs, you are not eligible to apply for EANS. Now, if you applied and you were denied the PPP, then we could consider your application, keeping in mind that there's a due date of April 30th and a whole bunch of parameters around the EANS program. Now, some districts, some non-public schools might be considering, well, what's the benefits of EANS versus PPP? North Carolina provided a great resource. It's highlighted on the bottom of this page and compares a bit of what does a PPP look like versus EANS. But actually, it's an either or. It's either a district non-public school would need to pursue the EANS avenue or the PPP avenue. It's not both. But feel free to review that resource if you or your organization are considering what is the best fit for you to move forward. For North Dakota allocations, we developed an estimated allocation process for you to use for your planning applications. Your estimated allocations were released last week, and they consist of two funding pots. There's essentially a base grant that looks at the number of 2019-20 K through 12 enrolled student counts. So that's your general enrollment for the school year. Everyone received a piece of the pie for all of their enrolled kids. Now there's a supplemental grant. As you remember at the very beginning, the department has to target those schools that serve higher number of students on free and reduced lunch, or those living in poverty. So for those schools, non-public schools that report free and reduced lunch, we use those numbers to develop a supplemental grant, an extra pot of funds. Adding those two together provide you with your base or your total allocation for planning purposes. Now, there were some non-public schools that, after taking those both categories into consideration, they had a small allocation. North Dakota is honoring a $10,000 amount as the base. So every non-public school will not receive less than $10,000 in services or assistance. I do want you to make note of a couple things. First, not every non-public school participates in free and reduced lunch. And in some instances, free and reduced lunch might not be the best data source for your non-public school to identify its need. We'll walk through that in the application process on what other data sources you may be able to provide. The other element that I'd like to highlight is these are estimated planning allocations. After all the non-public schools indicate their intent to participate by submitting an application, we will then take this information and run final allocations. In the meantime, we'd receive a preliminary approval, but you would receive like final budgeting amounts that we need to work with, and that would be later anticipated in June. So now let's go to the EANS application. You'll find the application, as we indicated, on your meeting invite. It is documented as a Microsoft Word form. It's in a locked format, meaning that you can type in cells, but you can't redo the entire document. If you need the form in a PDF or an alternate version, again, Jane is the person to reach out to, and you'll find her email at the end of the slide deck. If you have any issues with the application as you're working through, please let us know. And the application itself was slated to go live tomorrow, but you will find it right now today on the DPI website. So I'd like to, you can see the application, correct? Jane, thumbs up? Okay, perfect. So this is what the application looks like. It is an 11 page document, but know that not all of it, it's not 11 pages that you have to complete everything. I'll walk through this application, and it also is highlighted briefly in the slide deck, but I'd like to just walk through it at this time. When you're submitting your application, please submit it to the Department of Public Instruction's Office of Academic Support email. As indicated earlier, the due date is April 30th, 2021. If you are applying for EANS, if you want this reimbursement and/or services, you must submit an application. If a non-public school notifies us in July that they would like this service, unfortunately, that will be too late, and all of our funds for EANS 1 will have been spoken for. This is a general overview of the CARISA Act and the requirements, as well as budgeting requirements that you should be aware of. In the non-public school general information, it's important that you complete the authorized representative and who you would like to be as that main point of contact. This will be the person that we reach out to in the application questioning. If there's back and forth, this will be our primary point of contact. Now, there's also two numbers that you must be able to provide, the DUNS number and SAM's expiration number, because these are both federal funds that we'll be issuing and receiving. Don't sweat that right now. If you don't have a DUNS or a SAM's, we will be providing a use of funds webinar and have more information on a DUNS number and a SAM.gov number, or your SAM.gov expiration in that webinar forthcoming. We allow for a signature of that non-public school representative and the assurances. So as we indicated earlier, you need to assure that you are in operation. You need to assure that you're a non-public school. There's a section here about PPP and assuring that either A, you haven't received it, or if you have, you're not going to double dip. There's also a few assurances on the recognized control of funds. So everything provided with this program must be in public control for EANS 1. So whether it be services, materials, supplies, or property, whether we reimburse it or if it's provided, it needs to be in public control. And we will go through what that means later in the slide deck. All services, assistance, materials, supplies must be used in secular, neutral, and non-ideological ways. All equipment must be inventoried and must be used for the program and period of performance. Again, that's where September 30th, 2023 comes into play. Now note that every recipient, whether it be a non-public school receiving reimbursement or a contract that's provided to provide a non-public school with a service, everyone who's submitting this application agrees to the monitoring and reporting requirements that are associated. As I indicated in the most recent slide, there is a way for you to update your data. So all the data that must be provided needs to reflect the 2019-20 school year. Unfortunately, if you've had a huge influx of kids because of COVID, we still have to go back to that 1920 school year. And you must indicate your K through 12 student enrollment. You must also indicate the number of students from low-income families. Now, when we generated the estimated allocations, we used the free and reduced price lunch data. There might be other criteria that your school or non-public district has on file, such as scholarship or financial data, or financial assistance data, E-rate, data that you may have used for some other federal programs required by the Census Bureau, or proportionality data. In the proportionality data formula, if that is something that you would like to explore, that will probably require a one-on-one call between the State Department and your non-public school. What that would do is look at the current attendance area of your non-public school students, determine if they live in Title I attendance areas, and if that is so, then we would aggregate those student numbers. So you can use any of these data sources or all of these data sources. But let's say you have a non-public school student that receives free and reduced lunch, but also receives tuition assistance. We can't double count that child. They can only be counted in one category. But we do know that in some cases, some of your students might not receive free and reduced lunch because their family elects not to, but you know that they qualify for your scholarship or financial assistance. So you could then count that student there. You'll need to indicate which areas and the lump sum of students. Now, by dividing these two numbers, you'll get your average percentage. The law also requires us to indicate if you received that PPP loan prior to December 2020. So we're talking last summer's PPP loans. If you received it, yes or no, and then how much you received as an organization or as a school, and then what those funds, or that you'll assure that those funds won't be used for the same things that you're requesting in this EANS program. Lastly, for this section, the grantee or the applicant must indicate how the organization was impacted by COVID. So in this section, you may include information like the loss of tuition, loss of revenue, maybe the decrease in enrollment, or you had educators that lack the capacity, or just the digital connectivity for remote learning, or you could document your student learning loss. In this section of the application, you're really going to want to tell your story of how COVID still impacted your school and your organization. As I indicated earlier, the State Department's challenged with serving non-public schools that enroll free and reduced lunch students or high poverty students and were most impacted by COVID. Should we need to determine funds in a different way or a supplemental way to the allocation process, this question comes into play. I'm going to go back to the slide deck right now. The next section, Section D, will be covered in just a bit. Remember, if you have questions, please jot them down or chat them in the box, so then we'll address them at the end. So the application is open now, open today, March 30th through April 30th, 2021. So the law requires that we leave the application open for 30 days. The law also required that we issue the application within 30 days of receipt. Applications will not be accepted beyond April 30th. So in looking at the number of participants in today's webinar, there are many non-public schools that are not here today. We will share this recording with them. We'll share it with everyone that we have access to, but we are also asking you to reach out to your peers and spread the word because we do want to make sure that non-public schools are aware of this opportunity. A failure to submit an application by April 30th really indicates the non-public's intent not to participate. Now, we at the State Department will be doing extra calls and reach outs, but we also just want you to make sure that when you submit your application, we'll confirm that it was received via email, and you will have that record that it is received, but it has to be received by April 30th. And I think we say midnight or 11:59 on April 30th. Once the application is received, it will be reviewed and a conditional approval made within 30 days. So let's say that you are eager and have your application submitted by April 15th. The State Department would have until May 15th to give you that conditional approval. However, remember that final allocations will be released once we know who all is applying. So you will receive a conditional approval, but we're not done working together yet. So the next section talks about the types of services and assistance available. If you pull up your application, you'll be able to follow along with these activities. The law is very specific to outline the types of assistance that non-public schools can ask for. So the first is for supplies to sanitize, disinfect, and clean school facilities. We've received guidance from the U.S. Department of Ed. It is not the services to do this activity, but the actual supplies. Personnel protective equipment. So this might be face shields for your staff or masks for your students. Letter C, it's important to note this is not on a reimbursement basis. This one can only be provided through a service, and there's a very limited service. But improving ventilation systems, including windows or portable air purification systems. And I'll go into that in a little bit more detail on what, if we could reimburse, what it looks like. Again, another activity not allowed for reimbursement, but yes, allowed for services, is training and professional development for staff on the sanitation, use of PPE, and to minimize the spread of COVID-19. We can provide reimbursement or services to act as physical barriers to facilitate your social distancing. Materials or supplies or equipment recommended by the CDC for reopening the operation of school facilities to effectively maintain health and safety. Now, we do recognize that North Dakota schools are in a different place than many schools across the nation. There are many schools outside of North Dakota that do not have face-to-face instruction yet, or limiting that on a very, maybe a hybrid basis. So we do recognize that North Dakota schools, in particular our non-public schools, primarily are operating face-to-face and may have already purchased those supplies and materials. In those cases, reimbursement to give you financial relief for those investments does really make most sense. Letter G, expanding the capacity to administer testing and monitor and suppress the virus. That might be testing for your staff or by-next testing. Education technology, redeveloping instructional plans for remote or hybrid learning to address learning loss. This letter I activity, again, is not one that can be reimbursed, but it can be provided as a service. Letter J, leasing sites or spaces to ensure social distancing. K, reasonable transportation costs. And L, another one that we can't reimburse, but we can provide it as a service, and that's initiating and maintaining education and support services or assistance for remote or hybrid learning, or to address learning loss. So for many of the activities, I said, we can reimburse for this, or we can't reimburse for this, we can only provide a service. They were each labeled A through L. It's important to recognize that label. And on this slide and in the application document, it indicates which are not allowed to be reimbursed. The only exception to this is for letter C. If a non-public school invested in portable air purification systems, maybe portable units with a particular amount of airflow in your classrooms, those could be reimbursable. Recognizing, number one, it's a piece of equipment, it would need to be inventoried, and then also in public control, so it would have to be transferred to a public entity to maintain that inventory. I do want you to know that we are going to be hosting a webinar only on the use of funds, what this looks like, what reimbursement could be, or what services could look like. That webinar is coming up, I believe, next week. I have it listed at the end of the slide deck. Know at this time, the process that we are going to use for reimbursement or to secure the contracts for services, we do not have all those answers figured out yet. Whether it would be what has to be submitted, a receipt, is it through web grant systems? We're working on that, but we want you to know that it is a work in progress. This is the first time that the State Department has ever stood up a program such as this to support our non-public schools. There are some elements outlined in statute that are very clearly not allowable. The first is capital improvements. So no building, no physical structures, no revamping HVAC systems. Non-public schools cannot use these funds for staff payroll, salary, fringe, stipends, nothing like that. We can provide, as I mentioned before, a service. So if you were doing professional development on how to do remote learning, we could provide a service, but the stipending of your staff for that work and their time could not fall under the EANS program. There's no permanent renovations. So any materials, equipment, supplies need to easily be put in the non-public school and removed from the non-public school. No permanent purchases of school buses, no general operational costs. The law specifically says that we cannot use these funds for scholarship granting or providing vouchers or educational savings accounts that are often affiliated with those tuition assistance programs. I am going to flip back to the application real quick. So these activities we went through. I will highlight that there is a frequently asked questions document that the U.S. Department of Ed posted. It is very helpful. It was updated on March 19th. I'd highly encourage you to review that document and know that the State Department of Education will be developing its own North Dakota FAQ as well. In your application, you'll find 3 tables. The first table is a request for reimbursement for previous expenses. So keeping in mind that this goes back to March 13th, 2020, the day that President Trump declared the national emergency. Let's say that your non-public school bought hundreds of masks, hundreds of hand sanitizing stations, and boxes of Clorox wipes. You could identify those, again, looking at A through L, the allowable category, a description of what you purchased, and then what that amount requested is. Now, if it's a historical reimbursement, it's happened in the past, you'll have a good idea of what that reimbursement cost. So maybe it was $5,000. I'm not certain of that cost, but you could provide either an actual exact cost or a rough cost, knowing that for that reimbursement process, you will have to provide documentation that it was received, used, and paid for. Now, there are some elements, and of course, you'll put the sum right down here at the bottom. There are some reimbursements that are coming up. So maybe a non-public school has an order currently placed for 200 new Chromebooks. That would be a future reimbursement. It's not here quite yet. Maybe you're not going to receive them until October 2021. You would identify that allowable category, a description, and then the potential amount that you think you're going to need for those particular Chromebooks. Now, in the next category, this is a request for a future service or assistance. And so in some of the categories, in particular, there's 4 that we cannot reimburse on. So it's only services that can be provided. So let's say that we want to expand, I'm sorry, let me look here. We want to expand our training for staff on how to disinfect our classrooms and the use of PPE. We'd identify it as category D, provide that description, and maybe you would say we really want to do the contract with our public health unit or Sanford Health Program or whomever. You could identify it. No guarantee that that's exactly where the contract's going to come from, but give us an idea of what you'd like and what you think that is going to cost. The challenge with the EANS program then is when the State Department collects all these applications, let's say multiple non-public schools want D as a service, we then would procure a contract with potentially a public health agency or Sanford, or put it out for bid on the state system to procure that service to provide the non-public school with what it requested. So this is future services that you would like assistance on. One thing I'd like you to note, as far as we currently understand EANS 1 versus EANS 2, EANS 1 allows for reimbursement, so charts 1 and 2 can be completed, tables 1 and 2. EANS 2, as far as we're aware, the only thing that would be able to be completed is this 3rd table on requesting assistance. So if you have significant reimbursement that you would like to apply for, EANS 1 does make the most sense for you if you're not pursuing a PPP. I also want to highlight the last page of the application, and it is a non-public service agreement, a partner. So let's say that your non-public school already receives services from a Title I teacher 3 days a week, and you'd like to use your EANS funds to have that teacher present 5 days a week. But that teacher's already contracted through the public school to come and provide you that service. This would require consultation between the non-public school and that public district. So this page is who would you like to have as your preferred partner to do that contract. You would consult with your public district to say, hey, we're looking at applying for an EANS program. This is what we're thinking. Would you be willing to be our contract holder for that? If this application came in to extend that public teacher's time from 3 days a week to 5 days a week, we at the State Department then would contract with XYZ Public School District to add more staff time to your calendar. So that is the preferred service agreement partner, your public partner. If it's Sanford Health, again, it's not a guarantee, but it will help point the State Department in the direction that the non-public school wishes and wants. All right. So a couple special considerations. So first, there is no guarantee in funding or activity approval. So if the non-public school submits an activity and we provide conditional approval, know that there must be consultation so we figure out what this looks like, what that contracted service looks like, or what that reimbursement looks like throughout that program. So there has to be consultation, and the conditional approval indicates that you've submitted and we have an idea of what your non-public school would like for reimbursement and services, but there's a part B or a second part of the process that we have yet to secure. Please be mindful that all services and purchases must be secular, neutral, non-ideological, and be used in manners that are the same. So if we're purchasing a slew of laptops, we cannot use them for items that are not secular, neutral, or non-ideological. Also recognize that the ownership of any materials, supplies, equipment, whether it be purchased as a service or through a reimbursement, it is no longer public school district property. So that's where your public partner is also going to come into play. Potentially your public district could take that under their wing and their inventory, and it would be tagged as that public district inventory, and materials like the software, instructional materials, non-consumable items would be tracked and maintained as a part of the EANS program until either the end of EANS, which is September 30th, 2023, or until they're no longer needed. I will say the benefit of partnering with your public school district for this is you often receive federal title services, and that pool of equipment could transfer in under your federal title program at that time. I'm bringing this to your attention. We will help you with this process and work through this process. If you are a non-public school that does not have a public district partner, just make sure to note that in your application, and we will work with you, potentially as a state agency, being that public partner, or finding a public partner that makes most sense for you. As with all federal funds, we need to ensure that the services are reasonable, necessary, and allocable. So when we say reasonable, not excessive, and based on prudent purchasing practices. So yes, laptops were probably at a premium when you purchased them, if you purchased them last summer. That's understandable. But it does need to be a reasonable expense. Necessary. All purchases need to be aligned to those allowable activities and necessary as a result for carrying out activities associated with COVID. A few elements on an EANS timeline. So the timeline in particular on your screen is what was spelled out in our EANS law and guidance from the U.S. Department of Ed. Our North Dakota Governor's Office submitted an application on February 22nd. The U.S. Department of Ed approved us on March 1st, and by March 31st, which is tomorrow, we must disseminate information and make the application available. You all are here at this webinar hearing about information, and you actually got the application with Premier Access. So it's on our website now, but that was that 30-day deadline. The State Department then, or the non-public school then has 30 days to complete the application. So April 30th is when that is due. And DPI has 30 days to review and approve that conditional approval of the application. That actually brings us to May 31st. So we'll bump that to June 1st because of the holiday on the 31st. Keeping in mind, if you submit your application earlier, the State Department will work to have its approval within that same 30-day window. One element that's important to note is, as a state agency, we have to have all of our funds spoken for by September 1st, 2021. Meaning we either have to have all of the final allocations made and or contracts made up for these services. We have to have a really good idea of how these funds will be used. The department has $3.9 million for these services. Let's say we have $2.9 million available for we have an idea of what we're doing with them. The remaining $1 million would revert back to the governor's office for its Gear 2 program. It is our intent, with all intents and purposes, we'd like to use the entire $3.9 million minus administration for non-public schools. So that is why we're having that reallocation process in the final allocation, which will be around June. So as your head is swimming and you're thinking, now what am I supposed to do? Here are your next steps to put on your radar. So the application, it's currently available publicly, but by law, we were required to have it available March 31st. The EANS application window closes April 30th by 11:59. Again, you'd submit it to our email address on or before April 30th. If we need additional information, if you don't have a public partner or there's gaps in the application, the DPI will be working back and forth with non-public schools on that application. And in particular, we're going to reach out to your authorized representative. As I mentioned, you were going to have conditional approval, and that conditional approval is important because you're still going to get your final allocation. If your non-public student enrollment increased by another 15 kids because of tuition assistance, we want to make sure that your final allocation represents that. That final approval will be granted after we have all final allocations situated and amounts finalized. We anticipate that will be around that June 1st timeline. And keep in mind that DPI might approve full or in part or deny or renegotiate parts of the application that make most sense with the EANS 1 program and with contracting, procurement, and reimbursement processes. There are two things that we are learning quite a bit more about. They are our reporting requirements and monitoring requirements for EANS program. So with all federal programs, nothing goes without reporting and monitoring of some sort. With our current public school districts, we use a quarterly reporting process in web grants. We will be looking at what's required of the EANS program to best guess what we need to have in place to meet those reporting requirements at your local level, and then that's typically aggregated for the state level. As far as monitoring, the USDE, Department of Ed, has a disclaimer that they're able to monitor any of the EANS programs on and throughout the implementation. That goes for EANS 1 and EANS 2. We don't know what that looks like, so when we know more, we will share more. Also, by participating in this program, it does open up the EANS program for additional monitoring and checks by the Office of Inspector General. That is through the federal government and the North Dakota State Auditor's Office. Now, DPI will develop its own monitoring protocols as necessary. We're uncertain how the intersection of web grants with payment processes and reimbursement processes might meet many of our reporting requirements and monitoring requirements. So if there's gaps, we would identify those gaps as we find out about them. Okay, there's some resources I highly encourage you to look into. I've given a shout out to the U.S. Department of Ed's FAQ document. I indicated that was updated on March 19th. Definitely check out their website. OESE, the Office of Elementary and Secondary Education, is where you're going to find the EANS information. Also, our DPI website has information about the EANS program. We'll be posting all of our information, including a recording of this webinar there, and your allocations, estimated allocations, any resources and materials that we have available will be posted there. Now, if there is something like today's slide deck that you would like to have in its original format and it's not available that way on our DPI website, please reach out to Jane or myself and we'll get that to you. Technical assistance sessions. So we have a few more webinars like this on the books and they'll be recorded. So as I mentioned, we're going to do allowable uses and reimbursement. So those A through L, what can we do with it? A webinar next week, Thursday, right? Next week, Thursday, on allowable uses. I also have 2 office hours scheduled for April 14th and 28th. Those are going, I won't have a slide deck like this. They're going to be come with your questions and we will try to answer those as best we can. We're also in the process of working on a frequently asked questions document that will be published and could help guide. So those office hours are technical assistance times. Now, as you're thinking through who your public partner might be, we will be having a public partner webinar. So if you reach out to a public school district and they're like, I don't really know what you're talking about, there's a webinar on Friday, April 16th. We will do a specific reach out to the public districts in which your schools are located. But if there's a different public partner that you want to make sure is on that webinar, please let Jane know that and we'll make sure to add them. Okay, lastly, questions and contact information. So questions, we will open up everything at this time. And then also email addresses. If you have questions, you could definitely chat them and put them in an email to us. Myself, Stephanie Tucrow, and Jane Gratz. Rebecca and Shauna, I'll make sure to include your web addresses as soon as we have more fiscal details outlined, or your email addresses. So with that said, Jane, I see you're unmuted. So if you would like to ask or read any of the questions that we've gotten so far, that would be helpful.
Okay. The first question is, do we turn in the scholarship data and learning loss data with the application?
That's a great question. So at this time, you do not need to include student disaggregated data on the family's financial information, anything like that. We're asking for a lump sum of those scholarship students essentially to be reported. However, all of the data that's available here, you will need to identify and justify or have in your back pocket for auditing and monitoring purposes. So again, your student data for identifying learning loss as a need, I would include it in the narrative. There's a full page to have that narrative. You do not have to attach charts and graphs at this time.
Oops. Okay, next question is, how does the SEA provide services for learning loss? Can you please give several examples?
It's a great question. And the example that I did provide on extending maybe a current public district employee's time in your school could be one. Another could be contracted services, maybe buying X amount of slots at Sylvan Learning Center to receive additional tutoring or assistance. This is a complex program, a complicated program. This is the first time ever the SEA, the state, is being challenged with providing supports to a non-public school. So we also want to work with you on what your ideas are and how do we get to yes to provide that within the boundaries of the law.
Okay. How are services provided in Category I and Category L?
Okay, category, go through my paper copies here. I and L. I think that these are great questions. I think the two examples I have provided regarding learning loss could be the category L. What I see for category I is more professional learning on how do we assist our staff in redesigning instructional plans, maybe identifying priority standards. And so it is about a contracted service to provide that learning opportunity for your staff. Again, we will be having a webinar more specific on what the use of funds will be, and that's next week on the 8th.
Does providing a service for letter L require the hiring of a new third party, or is it possible to recognize reallocation of job description for someone currently employed at the non-public?
So all of these services that are provided in category L have to be in public control. the state cannot contract with a non-public employee or reimburse that employee payroll. If there is a non-public educator, let's say, that you'd like to do after-school tutoring, there could be potentially a contract that's developed with an outside third party, such as your local public school district, to contract with that educator to provide that after-school tutoring. So the contract does need to maintain in public control, and those services cannot supplant what's currently happening within a non-public school.
If a non-public school payroll is allowed, how do services for learning loss, or how are services for learning loss addressed?
Non-public payroll is not allowed.
Okay, so then this is what, an LD teacher contract? Could the public LEA hire a teacher and use these funds for our schools, such as an IDEA teacher?
Yes. If a non-public school wanted additional staff support for its special education students, it could consult with a local public school district, identify that they're applying for the EANS grant, and ask them to provide that service. The State Department then could potentially contract with that public district or potentially a public special education unit, provide that contract. They would secure that person to provide services to the non-public school for IDEA or special education.
Okay, and the next couple are kind of similar to the one you just said, but what about behavioral regression caused by COVID that contributes to learning loss? Can services be secured for classroom aides or behavioral interventionalists? And then it continues with, what about social and emotional needs associated with COVID-19?
So although the categories A through L do not address social emotional wellness of our students, we do believe that it could be justified under category L, provided that you have a public partner that will be in control of the services that would be provided to the non-public school.
Okay, and the last question is, could we work with a public partner to hire a paraprofessional to meet the learning loss need? Is remote learning subscriptions or device management service, does that fall under EANS 1? Or could those subscriptions fall under education technology?
So I think there's two questions there. The paraprofessional structure, again, working with a public entity, someone could be hired through that public entity to provide a service to a non-public school. It is going to be instrumental that a non-public school has its preferred partner identified and conversations happening. That's number one. Number two, can you repeat it, Jane?
Is remote learning subscriptions like the Seesaw or device management service, do they fall under EANS 1?
So,
or do they fall under I? I'm sorry, it was I. Do they fall under I?
So the tools like Seesaw, I see as educational technology, which would be H. I think that's more of a material and subscription type of a service. And yes, it's allowable. If it is reimbursed, it is no longer in non-public school district control. It moves over to as a public district purchase. If it is a service provided, which that doesn't really make sense as a service, we would say non-public school purchase it, and let's work with a public district to maintain control of that material supply software subscription.
Okay, that's it.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Oh.
Now, if you want to unmute yourself, if you'd rather ask a question out loud, feel free to unmute yourself and ask that question. And I'll also offer that if there are DPI team members who would like to provide further clarification or information, you could also unmute yourself and add to the conversation. Okay, wait time as an educator was not one of my strengths. So I will make myself available on this call. I'll stop the recording, but I want to welcome all of you to please apply for the EANS program. Please reach out to your neighbors, other non-public school partners in your community to make them aware. This recording will be available, and as we mentioned, there's a series of webinars that are also available or that will be made available. So mark your calendars, we'll communicate them out the same way. With that said, I thank you immensely for your time today. I look forward to partnering with you, and we look forward to providing the services to the students in our non-public schools in North Dakota. So thank you for your time, and we look forward to working together.